The February wind howled across the Montana Territory like a wounded beast, driving snow against the weathered walls of the McKinnon ranch house. Sarah McKinnon pressed her face to the frost-covered window, watching the white curtain of the blizzard swallow the familiar landscape of rolling hills and scattered cattle. At 19, she had witnessed many harsh winters, but this one seemed particularly cruel, testing the resolve of every settler who dared call this unforgiving land home. "Sarah, get away from that window before you catch your death," her father, Thomas McKinnon, called from his chair by the fireplace. His weathered hands worked methodically on a broken bridle, the leather cracked and worn from years of hard use. Despite being only 45, the Montana frontier had aged him beyond his years, carving deep lines around his blue eyes and streaking his brown hair with premature silver. "The cattle are huddled near the north fence again, Pa," Sarah replied, not moving from her post. Her breath fogged the glass as she spoke. "I can barely make them out through the snow, but they look distressed." Thomas set down his work and joined her at the window, his heavy boots creaking on the wooden floor. The ranch house, built with his own hands 5 years ago, was modest but sturdy. 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as both kitchen and parlor, and a small root cellar. It represented everything he had worked for since arriving in Montana Territory with Sarah and her late mother, Emma. "Storm's supposed to break by morning," he said, placing a calloused hand on his daughter's shoulder. "We'll check on them then. No sense risking our necks in this weather." Sarah nodded, though worry gnawed at her. She had inherited her mother's compassionate nature and couldn't bear the thought of any creature suffering. Emma McKinnon had passed 3 years ago from pneumonia, leaving Sarah to manage the household while helping her father maintain their modest cattle operation. The responsibility had matured her quickly, but it hadn't hardened her heart. As if summoned by her thoughts, a sound pierced through the storm's roar, faint and almost lost in the wind, but distinctly human. Sarah pressed her ear to the window, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense with concern. Thomas listened carefully, his brow furrowed. "Just the wind playing tricks, daughter. This storm's got everyone on edge." But Sarah heard it again, a weak, mewling cry that made her stomach clench with recognition. Without hesitation, she grabbed her heavy wool coat from the peg by the door. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Thomas demanded, rising from his chair. "There's something out there, Pa. Something alive." She wrapped her mother's thick scarf around her neck, the familiar scent of lavender still clinging to the wool after all these years. "It's probably just a coyote or—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her green eyes flashing with determination. "That's not an animal, that's a baby crying." Thomas's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm. "A baby? Out in this storm? That's impossible." But Sarah was already at the door, pulling on her leather gloves. "I'm going to look. I can't just sit here knowing something might be out there suffering." "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly, crossing to block her path. "I won't have you risking your life chasing phantom sounds in a blizzard." The cry came again, clearer this time, and both father and daughter froze. It was unmistakably the sound of an infant in distress, somehow surviving in the deadly embrace of the Montana winter. Sarah looked up at her father, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had carried the McKinnon family through countless hardships. "I'm going, Pa. With or without your blessing." Thomas stared at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the little girl who had arrived in Montana Territory 5 years ago, but a strong, compassionate woman who reminded him painfully of her mother. Emma would have done the same thing, consequences be damned. "Then we go together," he said finally, reaching for his own coat. "But we stay roped together, and if I say we turn back, we turn back. Understood?" Sarah nodded eagerly, already tying a length of rope around her waist. "Understood." They stepped into the storm together, the wind immediately trying to tear them apart. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing their breath and numbing their exposed skin within seconds. Thomas held a lantern high, its weak light barely penetrating the swirling snow, while Sarah called out, her voice quickly swallowed by the wind. "Here!" she shouted suddenly, dropping to her knees near a cluster of snow-covered rocks about 50 yards from the house. "Over here!" Thomas struggled through the drifts to reach her, the rope between them taut with strain. What he saw made his heart stop. Partially buried in the snow, wrapped in what appeared to be animal hide and beadwork, was a tiny bundle that moved weakly against the cold. "Dear God," he breathed, as Sarah carefully lifted the bundle, revealing the dark face of a Native American infant, no more than a few months old. The child's lips were blue with cold, but his dark eyes were open and alert, looking up at them with an expression that seemed far too wise for such a small face. "He's alive," Sarah whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks as she cradled the baby against her chest. "He's actually alive." Back inside the warm ranch house, Sarah worked with practiced efficiency to save the infant's life. She had helped deliver calves in harsh weather and tended to sick animals, but caring for a human baby was different, more delicate, more precious. The child couldn't have been more than 4 months old, his black hair damp with melted snow, his tiny hands curled into fists as he fought against the cold that had nearly claimed him. "Get me warm blankets and heat some milk," Sarah instructed her father, as she gently removed the child's wet wrappings. The hide and beadwork were beautiful, clearly crafted with love and skill, but they had provided little protection against the brutal storm. Thomas hesitated by the fire, his weathered face troubled. "Sarah, we need to think about this carefully. That child, he's not like us. His people, they might not understand what we're doing here." "What we're doing is saving a baby's life," Sarah replied firmly, wrapping the infant in her mother's softest quilt. "There's nothing to understand beyond that." She sat in her mother's rocking chair by the fire, holding the child close to her chest, feeling his tiny heart beating against her own. Slowly, warmth returned to his small body, and his crying softened to gentle whimpers. When Thomas brought the warm milk, diluted and cooled to the right temperature, the baby drank eagerly from a cloth dipped in the liquid. "Look at him, Pa," Sarah whispered, wonder in her voice. "He's so beautiful. Someone loved him enough to wrap him in these beautiful things. Someone is missing him terribly right now." Thomas studied the intricate beadwork on the infant's original wrappings, recognizing the craftsmanship of the Blackfoot tribe that sometimes passed through their territory. Relations between the settlers and the various native tribes had been tense but not openly hostile in their area, maintained through careful respect for boundaries and occasional trade. "The Blackfoot winter camp is about 20 miles north of here," he said slowly. "But with this storm it might as well be on the moon. Nobody could travel in this weather." "Then we wait," Sarah said simply, adjusting the baby in her arms as he settled into sleep. "We keep him safe and warm until the storm passes, then we figure out how to get him back to his family." "And if his family doesn't want him back?" Thomas asked gently. "There could be any number of reasons why he was separated from them." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but right now this little one needs us, and that's all that matters." As the night wore on, Sarah dozed fitfully in the rocking chair, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Thomas sat up keeping watch, adding wood to the fire and checking the windows for any sign that the storm was weakening. Around midnight, the baby woke hungry again, and Sarah patiently fed him more warm milk, crooning a lullaby her mother had once sung to her. "What should we call him?" she asked her father as dawn approached, the first grey light filtering through the windows despite the continuing snow. "Sarah," Thomas warned, "don't get too attached. This child has a family somewhere, a name already chosen for him." "I know that," she replied, but there was a tenderness in her voice as she looked down at the sleeping infant. "I just think he should have something to answer to while he's with us, something gentle." Thomas watched his daughter with the child and felt a familiar ache in his chest. This was how Emma had been, fierce in her compassion, unable to turn away from any creature in need. It had been one of the things he loved most about his wife, and seeing that same quality in Sarah filled him with both pride and worry. "Call him what you like," he said finally. "But remember, this is temporary." "Little Star," Sarah whispered, touching the baby's soft cheek, "because he appeared to us in the storm like a bright star in the darkness." The blizzard raged for 2 more days, trapping them all in the ranch house together. During that time, Sarah cared for the infant with a devotion that surprised even her father. She fashioned diapers from old sheets, warmed his milk with perfect timing, and seemed to instinctively know when he needed comfort or rest. The baby, whom she continued to call Little Star, thrived under her care, his skin regaining healthy color and his dark eyes growing bright and alert. On the morning of the 3rd day, Thomas woke to silence. The constant howling of the wind had stopped, replaced by the profound quiet that follows a major storm. He looked outside to see a world transformed, snow piled in enormous drifts, the familiar landmarks of his ranch barely recognizable under the white blanket. "The storm's passed," he announced to Sarah, who was feeding Little Star his morning milk. She nodded, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her was relieved that they could now begin the process of reuniting the child with his family, but another part, a part she was trying not to acknowledge, had grown attached to the tiny life she had saved. "I'll saddle the horse and ride north to the Blackfoot camp," Thomas said, pulling on his boots. "The snow's deep, but I can make it if I'm careful." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said immediately. "Absolutely not. The journey will be hard enough with one rider, and someone needs to stay here with Little Star," Sarah finished. "You're right, I should stay with him." Thomas paused in his preparations, studying his daughter's face. "Sarah, you understand that when we find his people, we'll have to give him back, don't you? This child belongs with his own family, his own tribe." "Of course I understand that," Sarah replied, but her arms tightened protectively around the baby. "I would never want to keep a child from his family. I want to make sure he's safe and wanted, that whoever lost him is truly glad to have him back." Thomas nodded, recognizing the protective instinct that had awakened in his daughter. "I'll be back before sunset," he promised. "Keep the fires burning and don't open the door for anyone but me." As he prepared to leave, neither father nor daughter could have imagined that their simple act of compassion was about to change not only their own lives, but the delicate balance of power and understanding in the entire Montana Territory. Thomas McKinnon had ridden through harsh Montana weather before, but never through snow this deep. His horse, Buck, a sturdy Mustang with winter-thick coat, struggled through drifts that sometimes reached the animal's belly. The sun shone brilliantly on the pristine white landscape, creating a glare that forced Thomas to squint beneath the brim of his hat. Despite the beauty of the snow-covered plains and distant mountains, he knew the journey ahead would test both his endurance and his courage. The Blackfoot winter camp lay 20 miles to the north, nestled in a valley that provided some protection from the worst of the prairie winds. Thomas had traded with members of the tribe before, exchanging cattle for horses or tools for handcrafted goods, but he had never ventured into their permanent camp. The thought of riding alone into a settlement of warriors, whose children and women might view him with suspicion, made his stomach clench with anxiety. As Buck plodded steadily through the snow, Thomas found himself thinking about the infant currently sleeping safely in his daughter's arms. The child's presence in their home had awakened something protective in Sarah that reminded him painfully of her mother. Emma had possessed the same fierce compassion, the same inability to turn away from suffering. It had been both her greatest strength and ultimately her downfall. She had caught pneumonia while tending to a neighbor's sick family during another harsh winter. The sun reached its zenith as Thomas crested a low hill and caught his first glimpse of smoke rising from the valley ahead. The Blackfoot camp sprawled along a partially frozen creek with dozens of buffalo hide teepees arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of wisdom about wind, water, and community organization. Even from a distance, he could see people moving between the structures, tending to horses, hauling water, and going about the daily business of survival in winter. Thomas paused, his heart hammering in his chest. He was one white man approaching a community of hundreds, carrying news that might be welcomed or might be met with suspicion. Relations between settlers and the various tribes had been relatively peaceful in their area, but Thomas knew that other parts of the territory had seen violence and mistrust. The loss of a child, however it had occurred, would be a source of tremendous pain and possibly anger. Taking a deep breath, Thomas urged Buck forward down the slope toward the camp. He had gone perhaps 100 yards when riders appeared, 4 Blackfoot warriors on horseback, moving swiftly toward him with the easy confidence of men defending their home territory. Thomas raised his right hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent, bringing Buck to a halt to wait for their approach. The lead rider was a man of perhaps 30 years, with intricate braids adorned with feathers and beadwork. His face was stern but not hostile as he called out in accented but clear English, "What brings a white man alone to our winter camp?" "My name is Thomas McKinnon," Thomas replied, working to keep his voice steady. "I have a ranch 20 miles south of here. 3 days ago, during the great storm, we found something that belongs to your people." The warriors exchanged glances, and Thomas saw something shift in their expressions, hope mixed with wariness. The leader spoke again, his voice tense with controlled emotion. "You found something of ours?" "A baby," Thomas said simply. "A boy, perhaps 4 months old, wrapped in beautiful hide and beadwork. He was nearly frozen when we discovered him, but my daughter has been caring for him. He's safe and well." The effect of his words on the four warriors was immediate and profound. The leader's stoic expression cracked, revealing raw pain and desperate hope. He spoke rapidly in his native language to his companions, then turned back to Thomas with urgent intensity. This child, he had a birthmark on his left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. Thomas felt his heart skip. He hadn't noticed any birthmark during the baby's care, but Sarah might have. I'm not certain. My daughter has been the one caring for him. She would know such details. The leader studied Thomas's face for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and gestured toward the camp. I am Running Wolf, he said. The child you speak of is my nephew, son of my sister Gentle Rain. 3 days ago, during the storm, raiders from a rival tribe attacked our hunting party. In the confusion of battle and blizzard, the horse carrying my nephew was lost. We searched until the storm made it impossible to continue. His voice carried the weight of 3 days of anguish and failed searching. My nephew lives? Running Wolf asked, and Thomas could hear the barely controlled hope in his voice. He lives, Thomas confirmed. My daughter Sarah has been caring for him as if he were her own child. He's warm, fed, and safe. Running Wolf closed his eyes for a moment, and Thomas thought he saw the warrior's hands tremble slightly. When he opened his eyes again, they shone with unshed tears. We must go to him immediately, Running Wolf said. Will you guide us to your home? Of course, Thomas replied, but I should warn you. The journey will be difficult. The snow is deep, and it will be slow going. We have waited 3 days believing my nephew was dead, Running Wolf said, already turning his horse toward the south. We can endure any hardship to bring him home. As they set out from the camp, Thomas found himself riding alongside men he had never expected to call friends. Running Wolf explained that the child's name was actually Lone Eagle, given to him because he had been born during a migration when an eagle had circled overhead for hours. His mother, Gentle Rain, had been inconsolable since his disappearance, refusing food and barely sleeping. Your daughter, Running Wolf said as they navigated a particularly deep drift. She has cared for Lone Eagle well, like he was her own, Thomas replied honestly. Sarah lost her mother 3 years ago, and I think caring for your nephew has awakened something in her. She calls him Little Star. Running Wolf smiled for the first time since Thomas had met him. Little Star. That is fitting. He appeared to her like a star in the darkness, bringing light to her heart as she brought warmth to his body. The journey back to the McKinnon Ranch took most of the afternoon, slowed by the deep snow and the careful pace needed to prevent the horses from becoming exhausted. As they rode, Thomas found himself engaged in conversations he had never imagined having, about cattle ranching and buffalo hunting, about the challenges of raising children on the frontier, about the harsh beauty of Montana winters. By the time they crested the final hill before his ranch, Thomas realized that his fear had been replaced by something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that this day might mark not just the reunion of a child with his family, but the beginning of a new understanding between two communities that had too often viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Sarah heard the horses approaching long before she could see them through the window. She had been expecting only her father's return, but the sound of multiple hoofbeats made her heart race with sudden anxiety. Clutching Little Star closer to her chest, she peered through the glass and felt her breath catch in her throat. Her father was riding toward the house, but he was accompanied by 4 Native American warriors, their horses moving with the fluid grace of experienced riders across the snow-covered ground. "Oh, Little Star," she whispered to the baby, who had been contentedly sucking on a cloth dipped in milk. "I think your family has come for you." The child looked up at her with those dark, wise eyes that had captured her heart 3 days ago, and Sarah felt a pain so sharp it took her breath away. She had known this moment would come, had even hoped for it, but the reality of saying goodbye to the tiny life she had saved and nurtured felt like losing a piece of her own heart. Moving quickly, Sarah rewrapped Little Star in his original hide blanket, carefully arranging the beautiful beadwork that told the story of his heritage. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and she found herself memorizing every detail of his face, the way his tiny nose crinkled when he was thinking, the perfect curve of his small mouth, the trust that shone in his eyes when he looked at her. The sound of boots on the wooden porch announced her father's arrival, followed by the softer tread of moccasined feet. Sarah took a deep breath, composed herself as best she could, and went to open the door. Thomas stood on the threshold, his face showing the strain of the long ride, but also something else, a kind of hopeful anticipation that she hadn't seen in him for years. Behind him stood 4 men whose presence commanded immediate respect. They were tall and strong, dressed in winter clothing that was both practical and beautiful, their faces marked by the kind of dignity that came from living in harmony with harsh but magnificent land. "Sarah," her father said gently, "I'd like you to meet Running Wolf and his companions. They've come for the baby." The man her father had identified as Running Wolf stepped forward, and Sarah saw in his eyes the same mixture of hope and fear that she imagined was reflected in her own. When his gaze fell on the bundle in her arms, his entire body seemed to tense with emotion. "This is your nephew," Sarah said softly, carefully pulling back the blanket to reveal Little Star's face. "I've been calling him Little Star, but your father told me his real name is Lone Eagle." Running Wolf approached slowly, as if afraid that sudden movement might make the child disappear like a dream. When he was close enough to see the baby's face clearly, he spoke a single word in his native language, a word that sounded like a prayer of thanksgiving. "May I?" he asked, extending his arms towards Sarah. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, every maternal instinct she had developed over the past 3 days screaming at her to hold on to the child. But she saw the desperate love in Running Wolf's eyes, the same fierce protectiveness that she herself felt, and she knew that Lone Eagle belonged with his family. "Of course," she said, carefully transferring the baby into his uncle's arms. Running Wolf held his nephew with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to children, but his hands shook with emotion as he examined the baby's face and limbs. He spoke rapidly in Blackfoot to his companions, and Sarah heard what sounded like expressions of relief and joy. Then he looked up at Sarah with tears streaming down his face. "You saved his life," he said simply. "Lone Eagle was dying when you found him. Without your care, without your compassion, he would have returned to the spirit world." "Anyone would have done the same," Sarah replied, though her voice caught in her throat. "No," Running Wolf said firmly, "not anyone. Many would have been afraid, or would have convinced themselves that what they heard was only the wind. You risked your own safety to save a child who was not of your people, not of your blood. This is the action of someone with a heart as vast as the sky." One of Running Wolf's companions, an older man with silver threading through his braids, approached and spoke to Running Wolf in their native language. Running Wolf nodded and turned back to Sarah. "My uncle, Grey Hawk, says that he has seen the care you have given to Lone Eagle. The child is well-fed, clean and content. He has been loved. This is a debt that cannot be repaid with words alone." Sarah shook her head, struggling to find her voice. "There's no debt. I did what any mother would do. I'm so glad he's safe and back with his family." "You are a mother," Grey Hawk said in careful English, studying Sarah's face with keen eyes. "Not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. Lone Eagle knows your heartbeat, knows your voice. He has bonded with you as a child bonds with the one who gives him life." As if to prove the old man's words, Lone Eagle began to fuss in his uncle's arms, his small face scrunching up in preparation for crying. Running Wolf tried to soothe him, rocking gently and speaking in soft Blackfoot, but the baby's distress only increased. "May I?" Sarah asked, stepping forward instinctively at the sound of the child's crying. Running Wolf handed Lone Eagle back to her, and the baby immediately quieted, snuggling against Sarah's chest with a contented sigh. The warriors exchanged significant looks, and Sarah saw understanding pass between them. "He has accepted you as his mother," Grey Hawk said quietly. "This creates a bond that transcends the boundaries between our peoples." Thomas, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "What does that mean exactly?" Running Wolf considered the question carefully before answering. "It means that in the eyes of our people, Sarah is now part of Lone Eagle's family. She is his white mother, the woman who gave him life when death was calling to him. This makes her our sister, and makes your family connected to ours in ways that will last for generations." Sarah felt the weight of his words settling around her like a warm blanket. "I don't understand what that means," she said honestly, "but I know that I love this child, and I want whatever is best for him." "What is best," Grey Hawk said, his weathered face creasing in a gentle smile, "is that he should know both sides of his family, the family of his blood and the family of his heart." Running Wolf nodded in agreement. "We will not take Lone Eagle from you permanently," he said, "but he must return to his mother, who grieves for him. She must know that he lives, must hold him and feed him, and remember how to breathe again." Sarah felt her heart breaking and mending at the same time. "Of course," she whispered. "He needs to be with his mother. But," Running Wolf continued, "when the spring comes and travel is easier, we will bring him to visit you. And perhaps you would honor us by visiting our camp, so that Lone Eagle can know both his worlds, both his families." Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms, then up at the men who had ridden through a blizzard to reclaim their nephew. She saw in their faces not the hostility or suspicion she had been taught to expect, but rather a kindness and understanding that spoke to the deepest part of her heart. "I would be honored," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As the sun set over the Montana Territory that evening, two communities that had known each other only through careful distance and occasional trade began to forge a new kind of relationship, one built not on fear or misunderstanding, but on the simple recognition that love for a child could bridge any divide. 3 months had passed since that snowy February day, when Lone Eagle was reunited with his family, and the Montana spring was painting the prairie in brilliant greens and wildflower colors. Sarah McKinnon stood on her front porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun as she watched a group of riders approaching across the rolling hills. Her heart quickened with recognition, the distinctive silhouettes of Blackfoot riders moving with their characteristic grace across the landscape. True to their word, Running Wolf and his companions had returned with the warming weather, but they were not alone. Sarah counted at least a dozen riders, including women and children, approaching the McKinnon Ranch with what appeared to be travois loaded with goods trailing behind some of the horses. "Pa!" Sarah called into the house, her voice tight with excitement and nervousness. "They're coming." Thomas emerged from the barn where he had been repairing a harness, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw the approaching party. Over the past months, he had found himself thinking often about Running Wolf and the conversations they had shared during that cold ride through the snow. The Blackfoot warrior had spoken of his people's struggles with changing times, of the pressure from expanding settlements, and the challenge of maintaining their traditional way of life while adapting to new realities. As the riders drew closer, Sarah could make out individual faces, and her breath caught when she recognized the figure of a young woman holding a familiar bundle against her chest. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive way the woman held the child, protectively, lovingly, but with the confidence of someone whose bond with the baby was unbreakable. "That must be Gentle Rain," Sarah whispered to herself, Lone Eagle's mother. The party halted about 50 yards from the house, and Running Wolf dismounted, approaching on foot as was proper when visiting another family's home. Behind him, Sarah could see the young woman with the baby sliding gracefully from her horse, her movements careful to protect the child in her arms. "Thomas McKinnon! Sarah McKinnon!" Running Wolf called out in his strong, clear voice. "We come to honor the promise made in winter's deepest cold." Thomas stepped forward to meet them, and Sarah followed, her heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. She had dreamed of this moment for months, wondering how Lone Eagle had grown, whether he was healthy and happy, whether his mother might resent the white woman who had briefly cared for her child. "Running Wolf," Thomas said warmly, extending his hand in greeting. "You and your people are welcome here, very welcome." "This is my sister, Gentle Rain," Running Wolf said, gesturing to the young woman who approached slowly, her dark eyes studying Sarah with intense curiosity. "And this is her son, who owes his life to your daughter's compassion." Gentle Rain was perhaps 22 years old, with the kind of natural grace that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the natural world. Her long black hair was braided with ribbons and small ornaments that caught the sunlight, and her dress was beautifully decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories Sarah could only guess at. But it was her eyes that captured Sarah's attention, dark, intelligent, and filled with a mother's protective love. For a long moment, the two young women studied each other across the cultural divide that separated their worlds. Then Gentle Rain stepped forward and, to Sarah's amazement, spoke in carefully pronounced English. "You are the woman who saved my son when the spirits of winter tried to claim him." Sarah nodded, suddenly tongue-tied in the face of this woman whose grief she had witnessed secondhand through Running Wolf's words months ago. Yes, I couldn't leave him out there. No one could have." Gentle Rain's serious expression softened slightly. "My brother tells me you called him Little Star during the time he was in your care." "I did," Sarah admitted. "I know his real name is Lone Eagle, but I needed something to call him, and he seemed to shine so brightly in the darkness of that storm." To Sarah's surprise, Gentle Rain smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "Little Star," she repeated, testing the English words on her tongue. "Yes, that is also who he is. He is Lone Eagle of the Blackfoot people, but he is also Little Star of the McKinnon family." She stepped closer to Sarah, adjusting the bundle in her arms so that Sarah could see the baby's face clearly. Lone Eagle had grown considerably in the 3 months since Sarah had last seen him. His cheeks were rounder, his dark hair longer, and his eyes held an alertness that spoke of a mind rapidly absorbing the world around him. "Would you like to hold him?" Gentle Rain asked softly. "He should remember his white mother's heartbeat." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she carefully took Lone Eagle into her arms. The baby looked up at her with those wise dark eyes, and after a moment of study, his face broke into a gummy smile of recognition. He made the soft cooing sounds that Sarah remembered so well, and her heart overflowed with love and gratitude. "Hello, Little Star," she whispered, and the baby responded by reaching up to touch her face with his tiny fingers. "He knows you," Gentle Rain observed with wonder. 3 months have passed, but he remembers." Running Wolf approached, his face glowing with satisfaction at the reunion he was witnessing. "Gentle Rain has learned some English words since winter," he explained to Sarah and Thomas. "She wanted to be able to speak with you, to thank you properly for what you did." "The thanks should be mine," Sarah said, reluctantly handing Lone Eagle back to his mother. "Caring for him helped me heal from losing my own mother. He gave me as much as I gave him." Greyhawk, the elderly warrior Sarah remembered from that emotional day in February, dismounted and approached the group. In his hands, he carried a beautifully crafted bundle wrapped in soft doeskin. "For Sarah McKinnon," he said in his careful English, offering her the bundle. "From the women of our tribe, for the one who gave life back to our child when death was calling to him." Sarah unwrapped the bundle with trembling hands, revealing the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. Made of soft buckskin, it was decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of blues and whites that seemed to tell a story of sky and snow and stars. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every bead placed with careful precision, every design element meaningful and beautiful. "I can't accept this," Sarah said, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gift. "It's too beautiful, too precious. You must accept it," Gentle Rain said firmly. "This dress was made by my mother and my grandmother and my aunts, working together through the long winter nights. It tells the story of Little Star's rescue, of the white woman who heard his cry in the storm and opened her heart to a child who was not of her blood." Sarah looked down at the dress, tracing the intricate patterns with her fingertip. She could see the story Gentle Rain described, beadwork that depicted storm clouds and falling snow, a lone star shining in the darkness, and 2 figures, one dark and one light, joining hands over a small bundle. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said honestly. Thank you all." Running Wolf gestured to the other members of his party who had been waiting patiently during the reunion. "We have brought our families to meet the McKinnons," he explained. "There are children who have heard the story of Little Star's rescue and wish to see the brave woman who saved him. There are elders who want to offer their blessings to the family that showed such kindness to our people." What followed was the most remarkable day of Sarah's life. The Blackfoot family set up a temporary camp near the McKinnon Ranch, and what had begun as a simple visit evolved into a celebration that bridged 2 cultures. The Blackfoot women taught Sarah how to prepare traditional foods, showing her the uses of native plants and sharing recipes passed down through generations. The men discussed hunting and horse breeding with Thomas, finding common ground in their shared understanding of life on the challenging Montana frontier. The children, initially shy, soon warmed to Sarah's gentle manner, and she found herself telling stories in English, while they responded with tales in Blackfoot, the language barrier dissolving in the universal communication of laughter and play. As evening approached and the cooking fires were lit, Gentle Rain approached Sarah with Lone Eagle sleeping peacefully in her arms. "There is something I want to ask you," she said, her English carefully chosen. "My brother tells me you have no husband, no children of your own." Sarah nodded, wondering where this conversation was leading. "In our tribe," Gentle Rain continued, "when a woman saves the life of a child, she becomes that child's second mother, not to replace the birth mother but to stand beside her, to share in the joy and the worry and the love." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What are you saying?" I am saying that I would be honored if you would be Lone Eagle's white aunt, his second mother. When he is old enough, he should spend time with your family, learning the ways of your people as well as ours. And you should visit our camp regularly so that you can watch him grow and help guide his steps. Sarah looked at the sleeping baby, then at his mother's earnest face, and felt something settle into place in her heart, a sense of family and belonging that she hadn't felt since her mother's death. I would be honored, she said simply. As the stars emerged in the clear Montana sky, two communities that had once viewed each other with suspicion and fear shared food, stories, and laughter around the flickering fires. Children who had been taught to be wary of the other played together as if they had been friends all their lives. Men who had once seen each other as potential threats discussed the challenges of frontier life with mutual respect and understanding. And at the center of it all was a baby named Lone Eagle, also called Little Star, who had become a bridge between two worlds through the simple power of a compassionate heart that refused to turn away from suffering. Sarah McKinnon had rescued a child from a winter storm, but in doing so, she had accomplished something far greater. She had proven that the bonds of love and compassion could transcend any barrier, cultural, racial, or religious. In saving one small life, she had opened a door to understanding that would benefit both communities for generations to come. Years later, when Lone Eagle had grown into a young man who spoke both English and Blackfoot fluently, who understood the ways of both the ranch and the prairie, people would say that he was living proof that two cultures could not only coexist, but could strengthen each other. And they would remember the day when a farmer's daughter heard a baby's cry in a blizzard and chose compassion over fear, changing the course of history with a simple act of human kindness. The bond between the McKinnon family and the Blackfoot tribe became legendary in the Montana Territory, a story told around countless campfires and dinner tables as an example of what was possible when people chose to see their common humanity rather than their differences. And every time the story was told, listeners were reminded that sometimes the smallest acts of love can build the strongest bridges between divided worlds.